Welcome to the Flash Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to be working with functions in ActionScript 3 Part 2. In this group of tutorials we're going to discuss functions that return a value in ActionScript. Building on what we've learned with the previous tutorial on functions, now we'll discuss functions that return a value in ActionScript 3. As you've already learned, functions are very powerful blocks of code that allow us to optimize our programming. The previous tutorial gave us the basic configuration of a function, but there are still many things to understand if we want a good grasp of how functions work in ActionScript and most other programming languages. The first thing we want to discuss is a part of the function statement that was not covered in the previous tutorial. Let's review the statement that we covered. So we have the basic syntax for a function on the screen. We start with the function keyword. We give the function a name, in this particular case, sample function. Then we have our parentheses, our opening curly brace. We put our code in between the curly braces. Then we close the curly brace and end it with a semicolon. And then we can call that function using the name with our opening closed parentheses and our semicolon. But we left out a portion of the function in the last tutorial, and I did it on purpose because I didn't want to complicate things. But we actually have another portion of that function called the void. And actually what it is, it's data typing what our return is. After the parentheses, we add a colon and the data type for the value that will be returned by the function. If no value will be returned by the function, we use the void identifier. And that's the one that you actually see on the screen. As we move through this tutorial, you'll see how we can return values from the function once it has been called. It is a best practice to use the void identifier when no value will be returned, even though it's not required. So the following data types can be passed by value in the return. We can pass strings, numbers, int, and you've learned about the integer value in an earlier tutorial, uint, the boolean, the null, and void. All other data types are passed by reference, and you'll understand what I mean by reference as we work through future tutorials. But these are the values, the data type values that we can return in a function return statement. So let's move into our development environment and work through some exercises on functions. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize our presentation and drop into our development environment. I'm going to go ahead and open up Flash, and we've got our standard branding screen on our stage. As I always use, the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and add a layer to our timeline. So I'm going to go ahead and click my Add Layer button, and I'm going to name this layer Actions. And I'm going to go ahead and lock that Actions layer. So I want to select frame 1 of my Actions layer. Let's do a save as before we do that. Let's go ahead and save this. This will be in your work files folder. If you have access to the work files, I'm going to go ahead and pull out our start because we don't want to use the start. And this will be 1006_1 inside the work files folder if you have access to those files. I want to make sure I've got frame 1 selected in my Actions layer. I'm going to go ahead and open up my Actions panel, F9 in Windows, Option F9 in the Mac. And the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and put our stop command in there. Stop, by the way, is a function inside ActionScript, in case you were wondering. I'm going to go ahead and put that stop inside there and come down a couple lines, and let's generate a function. So I'm going to create a function, and I want this function to be called getNum. And I'm going to open and close my parentheses, and this time we're going to data type this function because the return that we're expecting is going to be a number data type. So then I'm going to go ahead and open and close my curly braces, and inside that function I'm going to create a variable called num. It's the first time that we've actually done this. You can actually create variables inside of ActionScript. I'm going to data type that variable as a number, and it's going to be equal to 6. I'm going to end that with a semicolon. Then I'm going to type return num. So what we're actually telling Flash and ActionScript is take that variable, and I want you to return it outside the function. So when I call the function, I want you to return the value of the variable num. And then right below the function, let's go ahead and come down a couple lines. I'm going to create a variable called num. It's going to be data typed as a number. And then it's going to call that function, getNum. And I'm going to explain something here in a minute once I create this, and then we're going to come right below that and I'm going to say trace num, because you know, obviously there's nothing that we can see since we don't have anything on our stage. We can't see anything unless we actually trace it to our output panel. But let me explain what I've done here. This variable num that we created inside of our function, and you're going to find this true with most programming languages, that is not a global variable. That variable is only scoped inside the function. So in other words, it's only available inside the function. And that's why you see that I've created another variable. Actually, I have a typing error there. I've created another variable outside the function called num. This doesn't have to be the same name, by the way. This can be any name I want it to be. In fact, so that we don't make it confusing, let's call a variable number. Actually, number is not a good one. Let's call num1 so that you don't think it has to be scoped the same way. But the scope of the variable that's actually inside this function is only available in the function, and that's why we actually created another variable outside the function to go grab that return, and that's why we're calling the function through that variable. And this value now is going to become whatever's returned from that particular function. Let's go ahead and save this work. And we're going to go ahead and test our movie. Control Enter in Windows or Command Return in the Mac. And you'll see, let me go ahead and close the movie. You'll see that we've actually returned the value of that variable now in that trace statement. So we've actually gotten the value from the variable inside the function and returned it outside the function. And we're going to do a whole bunch more of this. I mean, this is very simplistic what we've just done. I just wanted you to see that it is possible to get a value or something inside of our function to actually come outside and work with our application. So again, we're going to do many, many more demonstrations of this. All right, so let's go ahead and continue with another example of how we can use these return values inside of ActionScript. I'm going to go ahead and remark this out. I'm going to come down a couple lines. Let's do a save as. I'm going to save this as our second example inside of Flash. And again, if you have copies of the exercise files, you'll have copies of all this stuff available to you. If not, you can just type it in with us. Let me go ahead and close our output panel. Okay, so we want to create another function, and I'm going to run this function very similar to the one we had just done, but I want to show you a concept about functions. So I'm going to say get num, a new concept, a semicolon. I'm going to data type my return as a number, open my curly braces. I'm going to create a variable inside the function. Variable num is going to be data typed as a number, and that's going to be equal to 6. Then I want to return num, just as we had done before. Then I want to say num equal 13, and I want to return num, end it with a semicolon. So let's go ahead and save those changes, and I want you to look at what we've done. Again, we've declared the function, we've given the function a name of getNum, we've opened and closed our parentheses, we've data typed our return as a number, then we've opened up our curly braces. But in here, I've done this a little bit different than the original one. Here I'm creating the variable num, and it's data typed as a number equal to 6. Then I'm asking the function to return num. Then I'm reassigning the value of that number variable to 13 and asking it to return num again. There's something that's unique about functions that you need to understand. Let's go ahead and call that function. So I'm going to create another variable just like we had done before, num, and I'm going to type that as number, and I'm going to say go ahead and run that function. So get num, so it's running the function that we've just created, and then I want to trace num to the screen, to the output panel, just as we had done before. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Good time to pause if you need to catch up with where we're at. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and test this movie, but I want you to think about what we're going to see in the output panel, because based on what you learned about variables, you may be assuming that we're going to see 13 in the output panel, but that's not the case. Let me show you. Let's go ahead and test this movie. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac, and you'll notice our output panel displays 6. And there's something that you need to understand about functions. It's a very important note. Notice the output panel displays the number 6, but in our code we reassign the value 13 to the num variable after the first return statement. In the method of a function, it will always return the value 6 in this particular example because the function code stops executing after the first return statement. And that's a very important concept of functions. You really need to catch that and bury it in your brain and keep it there. Because whenever you put a return statement inside your function, anything that falls after it will not be executed. And the key here is, so you really want to remember to put a return statement as one of the last things you do. But let's actually walk through this and I'll show you what I mean. Let's put a trace statement here. Because again, we can use trace statements just like we use trace statements outside of our functions. Let's go ahead and save that. And remember now that trace statement is right after our first return. So let's go ahead and test our movie, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. And you'll notice we're still seeing this, but we're not going to see this trace statement. If I were to take this trace statement and put it down here after my number 13, let's save the change. Test our movie once again. We're only going to see 6 because it's not getting past that first return statement. Anything we put after the first return statement is not being shown or not being executed. If I were to take the trace statement and put it up here before that return, let's go ahead and save that change. And again, you'll see that we use trace statements a lot in our code as we're testing. Now I should actually see 2 6s in the output panel because I'm seeing the first 6 from the trace statement right here that's got a value of 6 in here, and I'm seeing the second trace here for the value that we're returning from inside that function. So it's a very important concept to remember. Remember that once we hit a return statement inside of a function, all the code after it stops executing. Nothing executes after that first return statement. That becomes very important as you start building very complex functions. You want to make certain that one of the last things you do in the function is the return. All right, so now let's do something that you may actually really do in a program. I'm giving you some examples of how we get returns. I'm going to go ahead and remark this out, or comment it out as it's called. Come down a few lines so that you can see what I'm doing here. I want to do a save as on this particular file. We're going to save this as example number 3. Because now I'm going to create a function that you may actually use in a program. So the first thing I do is let's go ahead and create a function. And this function is going to be Celsius to Fahrenheit. So Celsius to Fahrenheit. And it's going to have a return value of cell, and that's going to be equal to a number. And I want to data type the return as a number. So now you're seeing we're actually going to push an argument into our function because that's what goes in these parentheses. I'm actually going to give it an argument that I want it to calculate on. I'm going to open my curly braces and close my curly braces, and my return is going to be 9 divided by 5 in parentheses times whatever the value of cell is plus 32. And I'm going to end that with a semicolon. So now we're actually creating a function that's going to calculate something. It's going to take the value of whatever I pass in, and it's going to take 9 divided by 5 times that value and add 32 to it. And that's going to give us the Celsius of that particular number. So let's do a trace. And this time when I call that Celsius, so I'm going to say CEL CICUS and then to Fahrenheit. So in other words, the name of my function, I'm calling the function in my trace statement, and the argument I'm going to pass is 37 for 37 degrees. So I'm actually passing this value right here is becoming this variable cell, and it's going to be used inside the function to calculate the return. Let's go ahead and save that. If we test our movie, Control Enter in Windows or Command Return in the Mac, our output panel should be 98.6666, and it's just telling us what the Celsius value is. So it's taking the Celsius value, the Celsius temperature, 37 degrees, and calculating it to a Fahrenheit temperature. And that's how we set the function up. And that's going to work regardless of what value we pass in. I could pass in any value I wanted. What if I were to change this to a 33? Save that change. Again, test our movie, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. Now it's calculated 33 degrees Celsius as 91.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Great time for you to pause if you need to go ahead and type this in. So now you can see that we can actually pass values into functions and have the function calculate based on the value that we pass it. And it's not just numbers we can pass. We can pass anything. What if this was a variable? I could actually declare a variable and then have the variable assigned to that parameter. All right, so let's take it a step further. Above our function, let's declare a variable. Now that you're very familiar with how variables work, I'm going to declare a variable called Celsius. I'm going to data type it as a number, and I'm going to give it a value of 22, and then that with a semicolon. And now when I call the function, instead of putting a value here, let's just put in the value of the variable. CELCIUS, so now we're actually passing the value of the variable into the function. Let's go ahead and save that. Let's do a save as. We're going to save this as demonstration number 4. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that stuff in. Let's go ahead and test this movie. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. And now you'll see 71.6 because now I'm actually passing in the value of this particular variable. And if I were to change this variable, save that change and test our movie, now it's 50. And again, it's calculating it now based on whatever the value of the variable is, because we're actually sending the variable into the function instead of fixing a number into that trace statement. So there's a whole lot of different things that we can do with functions, as you're going to see as we keep moving through these exercises. But I mean, they're very cool. Very, very cool. So it's displaying the correct Celsius temperature dependent upon whatever value we actually put inside this variable. 100 degrees Celsius, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, let me go ahead and close our output panel. And let's look at another example about how we can pass parameters into functions. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. I'm going to come down in my ActionScript panel. Let's go ahead and do a save as. I'm going to save this because this is going to be a bigger example of what we've been doing. Let's save this as work file 5. Okay, now I want to create a couple of variables here. So I'm going to say variable num1. That's going to be equal to a number that's going to be equal to 4, and that with a semicolon. Then I create another variable num2, and again data type as a number that's going to be equal to 8. Var num3, data typed as a number. Let's make that one equal to 12, and let's create one more variable var num4, data typed as a number. And let's make that one equal to 16. These could be any numbers that you wanted, by the way. I just grabbed those numbers from thin air. Now I want to create a function. And let's call the function sum. And then open my parentheses. And I'm going to pass in 4 parameters. The first parameter is going to be a. That's going to be a number. Then I'm going to put a comma. B is going to be data typed as a number, comma. C is going to be data typed as a number, comma, and then D is going to be data typed as a number. And then I'm going to close my parentheses. I'm going to data type my return as a number. Let me go ahead and stretch this out so it's not wrapping on you so you can see what we're doing. I'm going to data type that return as a number. Then I'm going to open and close my curly braces, and I'm going to come down into the function itself. And what I want to do is I want to return A plus B plus C plus D. Again, I don't need these spaces in here. I'm just putting them in so it's easier for you to see what we're doing here. And then I'm going to come down here and I want you to say trace inside parentheses sum. So I'm calling the function, and now I'm going to pass the parameters to the function. num1, num2, num3, num4, close the parentheses, close the opening parentheses, and end it with a semicolon. So let me go ahead and save those changes. good time for you to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in, and then I'm going to talk you through what we've just done. Okay, so what I've done is I've actually created 4 variables that each hold whole numbers. I've created a function, and I want the function to sum all those numbers together. And what I'm passing in my trace statement are the values of these variables. So I'm calling my sum. Remember, inside trace, we always have trace enclosed in parentheses. So I'm calling my sum function, and these are the parameters that we're passing into the function in order for it to return a value. So if I save all those changes and I test my movie, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac, you'll see that my value returned is 40, which is the sum of all these values. If I were to change one of these variables, let's change variable number 3 to 20, and save that change, it's going to impact the return I get from the function. Again, I'm going to test the movie, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac, and now you'll notice it's 48. Because as we change these values, the function's still functioning. It's doing exactly what we told it to do. It's adding the 4 numbers together, and it's based on the value of our variables. So if I had something in my application that was actually updating these values, I could go back and keep calling this function to redo my totals, for instance, like a shopping cart system. So as these purchases were changed and my program executed, it would update the values that we're seeing in the output window. So again, you're getting an idea now how we can use functions to perform calculations inside of ActionScript. By using variables, we've made it very easy to update our values without having to modify our code. Again, as we discussed earlier, by using variables, we could link the parameter to an input text box on the stage for user input and then run the function. So let's look at another example in ActionScript 3. ActionScript 3 has added a new parameter called the rest parameter. The rest parameter is a symbol of 3 dots. This represents a variable number of arguments. It's used when the exact number of arguments passed to the function may not be known at development time. It's written as 3 dots followed by the array that will be used to contain the values. We'll cover arrays in depth in a future tutorial, but I just want you to see how this works inside of a function. So let's use our same function as before, but modify it slightly to support a new feature. All right, so we're going to make some modifications to the function. I'm going to go ahead and put these values back. So I've got 4, 8, 12, and 16. And again, it makes absolutely no difference what these values are. I'm just putting them back so that you know what the calculation should be, and it's easy to confirm that everything's working right. I'm going to do a save as because I want you to be able to keep both versions of this if you have access to the exercise files. So I'm going to save this as work file 6 inside of the exercise folder. So I'm going to use my 4 same variables that we used before, but I'm going to change the function. I'm going to come into the function and I'm going to use what's called the rest feature. This is new to ActionScript 3, but it's 3 dots and then numbers. And what this numbers is, it's an array that we're going to create, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. And again, we will cover arrays in depth in a future tutorial. But what I want to do now is I want to come down here and I want to create a variable called result. And again, we're inside the function. So I'm creating a variable called result number equals 0. And these are all reserved words. This is the number that we're going to create as the array, and result is a reserved word. We're actually just calling it inside of ActionScript. And it's going to say for each. So I'm using a for each loop. And again, I know we haven't covered this, but we will in future tutorials. Var num, which is data typed as a number, in numbers. And that's the actual array that we're creating. So what it's doing is it's looking at how many of these var num we have, and it's going to create an array called numbers. And then inside there, it's actually just going to push that result into the array. So result plus equal, and again, we'll cover these operators in a future tutorial. I just want you to see how this would work in the function. And then I come down outside of my for each, and I return the result. And I end that with a semicolon. So now when I run this trace statement, it doesn't make any difference how many numbers I have here. It's going to continue to calculate those based on the array. So let's go ahead and save those changes. Let's go ahead and test our movie. Control Enter in Window, Command Return in the Mac. And you'll notice now we've got our variable 40, our result 40, even though we didn't individually reference those numbers inside the function. Because by using that rest feature and numbers, we created an array which is storing all these variables, and it's going in and summing them for us. That's what this result is, plus equal, so it's adding to it. Whatever you have, add this to it. So the first time it goes through, it's 4. Then it says, okay, you've got 4, now add 8, so now it's 12. Now you've got 12, so add 12, now it's 24. And then it's a very cool feature inside of ActionScript. Now we're using a for each loop to walk through the number of variables that have been assigned as parameters. We'll cover for each loops in a future tutorial, but I wanted you to see the new rest parameter while we're working with functions. Also notice that we declared a new variable in the function for the result called total. Each time it walks through the for each loop, it adds to that. And actually, I just did it with result, but we could have done it with a total. Let's confirm that we have multiple variables by adding some variables to the declaration statement. So let's go ahead and close out this panel for a minute. And let's go back up and let's add a couple more variables. So let's say var num5, data type that one as a number, and that's going to be equal to 20. And then let's say var num6, data type that as a number, and that's going to be equal to 20. And stop those. And now we got to remember though, because we're calling those new ones, we actually have to add them into our statement here. So let's say num5, num6. So we've added the variables to a save as. We've made no changes to our function though. All we've changed is the variables that we're passing to it. And now because we've made those changes to that work, when we test this movie, we should see those additional variables added into that total, which should take us to 40, or to 80, I'm sorry. So again, let's do a Control Enter, Command Return in the Mac. And now you'll notice we have 80 at the output panel. So we've made no changes to our function, but by adding additional variables and by using that rest statement, we can put as many things as we need to put into this function to get those sums. So again, you don't have to know the exact number that's going to be appearing in there. I hope this is beginning to give you an idea of how powerful functions can be. And we're just barely scratching the surface. I just want you to see some of the stuff that we can do with functions at a very basic level, so that when we start moving through these tutorials and we start doing a lot more complex stuff, you'll understand the basic function of a function, how they're supposed to work, and the structure and how they're supposed to be set up. So let's go and do a little bit of review of what we covered in this tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our development environment. Let's go ahead and bring back up our presentation, and let's do a quick review of what we covered in this tutorial. All right, so we looked at the function keyword and how we set it up using our functions. We used the trace statement to trace things to our output panel so you could actually see what was occurring inside the function. We used a return statement to actually return values from our function so that we could use those values outside the function itself. We talked about variables and the scope of variables inside functions and how those variables are only available in the function, and if we actually want those values back, we need to return them to something that's outside the function. We looked at the number data type. Again, we used our F9 for Windows or Option F9 for the Macintosh to test our movies. We talked about passing parameters into a function and how we can actually do that using variables or using fixed parameters, as we did with the Celsius demonstration. We use variables to hold parameter values at the top of our code and then pass those variables into our function. We looked at using multiple parameters in a function. We looked at building an array inside of our function using that rest feature. We looked at the for each loop. And again, we'll go into much more detail on arrays and much more detail in the for each loop when we get to that portion of the tutorials. I just wanted to demonstrate that rest feature for you, and the best way to do that was to actually have it build an array and use the for each loop to walk through it. We configured the rest parameter so that the function didn't have to know how many variables were coming into it or how many parameters were coming into it. And in the next tutorial, Functions Part 3, we're going to put it all together and do some stuff on our stage that I think you'll find pretty interesting.